Good evening. Today is December 9th. I'm sorry. Today is December 8th. I'm getting a day ahead. December 8th, 2020. Hope everybody's had a good day. It was 40 years ago today that one of the greatest musicians and songwriters of all time passed away. I'm speaking of none other than John Lennon. And for those of us who are children of the 1960s, who were affected in some way by Beatlemania, some more than others. But I never will forget this day, 40 years ago. At the time, I was living in Kaufman, Texas, where I was serving as pastor of Macedonia AME Church. And I was also employed with the Texas Department, what was then called Human Resources. It's now Human Services. I was employed in Dallas with vocational rehabilitation. And about a week earlier, I had been to Terrell State Hospital and filled out an application. So Terrell was only 12 miles from Kaufman, so that was certainly going to be closer to my house. And I actually got an interview in February of '81 and went to work there in April of '81. But that was a few months away. I was still working in Dallas on December 8th, 1980. I was driving from Kaufman to Dallas up uh, 175, and I heard on the radio that John Lennon had been assassinated. I stopped at a convenience store and bought a newspaper to read about this, and it was something that touched a lot of people. And John Lennon was 40 at the time. His birthday is October 9th, so he would be 80 if he were still living. He's described as an English singer, songwriter, and peace activist who achieved worldwide fame as the co-founder, co-lead vocalist, and rhythm guitarist of the Beatles. He had a songwriting partnership with Paul McCartney, and Paul McCartney played bass, George Harrison played lead guitar, and Ringo Starr played drums. Ringo is still living. Back in July, I believe July 7th, he turned 80. Paul is still living. He was a few years younger. George died of cancer in 2001. But It was in 1969 that John Lennon started the Plastic Ono Band with his second wife, Yoko Ono. After the Beatles disbanded in 1970, he continued a career as a solo artist and is Ono's collaborator. Um, he has two sons that are both have been involved in music. Uh, his older son, Julian Lennon, by his first wife, Cynthia, and uh, his younger son, Sean Lennon, by his second wife, Yoko Ono, a native of Japan. And so John Lennon was just a very talented musician and songwriter. And the Beatles were very popular in the 60s. I never will forget when they came on the Ed Sullivan Show, and it was their debut, American television. My wife was never a very big Beatle fan, but she does remember the night that they appeared, in which she burn the popcorn. They had some neighbors that came over to watch the Beatles on TV, and he wrote a couple of books in his own right, and a Spaniard in the Works, and he was also an artist, and his songs were adopted as anthem by the anti-war movement and also the larger counterculture of the 1960s. He produced more than a dozen records with Ono, and one of the most popular was Give Peace a Chance. Another was Happy Christmas, War is Over. After moving to New York City in 1971, his criticism of the Vietnam War resulted in a 3-year attempt by the Nixon administration to deport him. In 1975, he disengaged in the music business to raise his infant son Sean, and in 1980 returned with the Ono collaboration, uh, Double Fantasy. It took a while before he could become a permanent resident. He won his battle against deportation, and in January 1977, he and Yoko attended the inauguration of President Jimmy Carter, who had a much more favorable attitude toward him than had Richard Nixon. And John Lennon was far from perfect, but nobody's perfect. No human being is. And but he did a lot of good. And the Beatles' legacy is mixed. Some of it's positive and some of it's negative. But um, he um, previously had a band called the Quarrymen, later the Beatles, and they became very popular. In 1963 is when they made it to America. It was, I gotta say, I was pastor in Kaufman at the time that John was assassinated, and I recall asking a number of people if the Beatles were very popular in the African American community. I got a mixed response. Some just as the way it is among white people. Some black people liked them and some didn't. And they were very honest about the influence of black singers like Chuck Berry and Little Richard on their musical style. And my later research for my book on Blind Lemon Jefferson, I found out that the song they did, Matchbox, in which Ringo sang the lead, and that was very unusual. Uh, that was a remake of a Blind Lemon Jefferson song. Sit here wondering with a matchbox hold my clothes. I ain't got no matches, but I sure got a long way to go. And when they performed in Houston, another blues man by the name of Lightning Hopkins showed them some stuff on the guitar. And so they recognized that among blues and soul, there was a great deal of influence, and across crossbreeding, you might say. During the 1960s, there were at least four distinctive sounds in rock and roll. There was the British sound, represented by the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and so many other groups. And then there was the Memphis sound, like Chuck Berry and later Johnny Rivers, and the West Coast sound of the Beach Boys, Jan and Dean, and some others. And then there was Motown, based in Detroit, and Diana Ross and the Supremes, Wilson Pickett, Sam and Dave, the Temptations. Could go on and on, but a lot of these things developed along about the same time. And there was a band called the Ronettes, and there was a singer named Estelle Bennett who George Harrison briefly dated. And there was a lot of criticism for him dating a black woman. He did not marry her, but I think George eventually married a woman from India. Of course, John was married to a Japanese woman. So they were very much into treating people equally, regardless of race or color. And I remember seeing their movies. One was called A Hard Day's Night, another was called Help. And the Lennon wrote the song All You Need Is Love as Britain's contribution to our world satellite broadcast before an international audience estimated at up to 400 million. Intentionally simplistic in its message, the song formalized his pacifist stance, provided an anthem for the summer of love of 1967. I was 16 at the time. I had a rock band called Noise Unlimited in Waco. We never made the big time. For everybody that did, there was a whole slew of us that didn't. But we had fun along the way. And I can remember the summer of love. A lot of that was in the news. And the Beatles were eventually introduced to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. They traveled to India to learn transcendental meditation, which was also controversial to say the least. That was in February of '68. Uh, only George maintained a permanent interest in Hinduism. John had a song called Revolution. He called for a plan rather than committing to a Maoist revolution. The song's pacifist message led to ridicule from political radicals in the New Left press. He's saying that we all want to change the world, but if you calling for destruction, I want you to know you can count me out. And said that if you want money for minds that hate, I tell you, you're going to have to wait. Then he said uh, that if you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't going to get my help anyhow. So uh, but political activism taking place. The Double Fantasy album was released toward the end of John's life, in which one of the most famous songs was Starting Over, and things um, that's what John was trying to do, but sadly it was cut short. And um, well, he was assassinated by a fan named Mark David Chapman uh, in front of the Dakota apartment building in New York City where he was living at the time. And very sad event. There were candlelight vigils and other types of observances held throughout the world. I remember hearing that in Dallas there was a candlelight vigil planned at Lee Park in the Oak Lawn area, which had been the site of a number of anti-war demonstrations during the 1960s when America was heavily involved in Vietnam. I did not attend. I held a one-man candlelight vigil in Shannon Park in Coffee. I bought a copy of a Beatle songbook and played a number of the songs on my guitar. It was quite a time, and it's interesting that John Lennon was assassinated just 1 month following the election of Ronald Reagan as President of the United States. And there was a number of items in the media about the comparison between the two. On the one hand, you had Beatles and peace marchers. On the other hand, Reagan and bigger defense budgets. And um, a number of articles were written. I collected a bunch of them in a file. Number one in the Dallas Morning News talked about John Lennon and the death of the 60s. It listed some very prominent people who had made big news during the 60s. By 1980, all of them were dead. And the 1980s was presented as a conservative decade. And in many ways it was. And in another video, we can talk more about this, but it's interesting to me that liberals claim the 1960s, conservatives claim the 1980s, but nobody claims the 1970s, which was also a very eventful decade in which a lot of things, very important things, took place. Well, it was on October 9th of 2010. I believe that was the date of it. Hold on a second. It was in John's hometown of Liverpool, England. that the John Lennon Peace Monument, also known as the European Peace Monument, entitled Peace and Harmony, was dedicated to John's memory. Yes, it was dedicated on Saturday, the 9th of October, 2010, which would have been John's 70th birthday. And uh, I'm sure it's been visited by a lot of people over the years. And at the dedication, John's son Julian said, "We come here with our hearts to honor Dad and pray for peace and say thank you to everybody who is celebrating today." And there was a vigil held there 10 years ago today. Some of John's fans made their way to Liverpool on the 8th of December 2010 to mark the 30th anniversary of John's death with a candlelight vigil that took place at the city's European Peace Monument dedicated to John. And um, according to Jerry Goodman, director of the Beatles story, although the European Peace Monument has only been on public display for a little over a month, it's already taken on a global significance of its own. People from all over the world are coming to the city to pay their respects and consider John's message of peace through his music. We sure need that message today. So, on the 40th anniversary of the assassination of John Lennon, I wish to pay tribute to him and urge us all to resolve ourselves to work for peace and try to bring people together, which was the purpose of much of John's music. Have a good evening.